In this video, we are going to talk about a mystery of early Buddhist art. But before we do so, let's just first define what an early Buddhist art is. So the art that was produced in the early period and up to the period of 100 BC can be roughly qualified as early Buddhist art. So we are talking about the sculptures from the stupas of Sanchi, Barhut and Amravati. And in most of these stupas, we find that the life of the Buddha is also depicted. So here are some of the examples of these sculptures. Here we have a sculpture that represents the conception of the Buddha or Avakranti. You can see Maya, the mother of Buddha, sleeping on a couch, and above her there is an elephant. The sculpture which you are seeing now depicts the birth of Buddha. You can see Maya is sitting on a lotus flanked by two elephants. Now this sculpture shows the story of Buddha's departure from the city of Kapilavastu. In Buddhist texts, this event is referred as the Great Departure or Mahabhinishkramana. So these are some of the examples of early Buddhist art. Having seen these sculptures, have you noticed something odd about these sculptures? If you haven't, I request you to watch these sculptures again. And to those of you who thought that it is quite odd that the sculptures which talks about Buddha's life does not really show Buddha. So to those of you who thought that, you are right. This is what odd about the early Buddhist art. We find that in most cases, early Buddhist art does not show Buddha in human form. You can see more examples of how in the early Buddhist art, Buddha is not represented. Instead, we find that there are different symbols that denote Buddha. So here are some more examples. In this sculpture, you can see that the Bodhi tree represents the enlightenment of the Buddha or the event when Buddha achieved enlightenment. Now this sculpture depicts the first sermon of Buddha which he gave at Sarnath. And in order to represent this event, the artists have used Dharma Chakra. In this sculpture, you can see that the death of the Buddha or Mahaparinibbana is depicted. And in order to depict this event, a stupa is used. So in these examples, you can clearly see that instead of showing Buddha in human form, various symbols are used to depict him. Now, because of this, some art historians have argued that the early Buddhist art did not allow the representation of Buddha in human form. And this argument was based on the assumption that the early Buddhist art was made by the Buddhists who followed the Hinayan tradition, which did not use image of Buddha to worship him. So these historians argue that it was only with the arrival of the Mahayana tradition, Buddha is represented in human form. And we find that during the Kushan era, particularly the 2nd century AD, we find that Buddha is represented in human form. So this assumption that during the early phase of Buddhist art, Buddha was not represented in human form was never questioned. But in the works of scholars like Susan L. Huntington and John Huntington, we find that these historians have questioned this assumption. And in this video, we will look at what are the arguments which these historians have made in order to show that during the early phase, Buddha was represented in human form. So the first argument which these historians make is that even during the lifetime of Buddha, we can see from various different Buddhist texts that the image of Buddha was used to worship him. And they argue that in all Buddhist literature, there is only one instance where we can clearly see that there is a ban on images of Buddha. And this text belongs to the sect of Sarvastivadin. And here we find that there is a passage in which Anand, the disciple of the Buddha, asks the Buddha that since your images are not allowed, can we at least make images of the Bodhisattvas? So it is from this passage scholars have based this assumption that there was a prohibition on the image of the Buddha. Now, when we look at the text of other sects, particularly sects like Mahasamghika and Dharmaguptaka, we find that there is no such prohibition. Now, when we analyze this passage, we can clearly see that this restriction was written because some other sects and other people were making the images of the Buddha. And we find that during the Kushan era, even the Sarvastivadins have forgotten about this prohibition. Another important argument which these historians make is that when we look at the earliest Buddha sculptures that have survived, all of these sculptures follow a strict convention. So the fact that these early Buddha sculptures follow a strict convention means that before this period, there was a time when these conventions were being formulated. And most of these images that were made during this period did not survive because these images were made from wood. We all know that during the early phase of Indian architecture, buildings were made from wood. So it is not hard to imagine that wood was also being used for sculptures. And another important aspect about this early phase where wood was being used for making the images of the Buddha is that all of these images were made in the region of Ganga Valley. It is only with the arrival of the Kushanas we see that stone was being used in a massive quantity for the depiction of Buddha in human form, and that is why most of these images have survived up until this period. Susan Huntington makes an important point that in the sculptures of Sanchi, Barhut and Amravati, the image of the Buddha in human form is not shown because the emphasis of the artist was not on the Buddha itself. Instead, the main aim of these sculptures was to emphasize the relics that were present in the stupa. So there was no need to show Buddha in human form. Another important point which Susan L. Huntington makes is that this notion of idolatry or the prohibition of Buddha image is based on a Abrahamic concept, particularly the prohibition of images in Islam. Instead, she argues that when we look at the Indic religions, particularly Buddhism and Hinduism of this period, there was no such notion of prohibition of images. So these are some of the main arguments of scholars who have argued that there was no such phase in Buddhist art where Buddha was not shown in human form. But like many topics in ancient Indian history, this debate has not been resolved. What we can see is that there is certainly a shift in the later Buddhist art, and we can see this for ourselves. So these are some of the examples. So in early Buddhist art, the scene of Buddha's birth is shown like this. Whereas in the later period, we can clearly see that Buddha is shown as a child. Then we can see that in the early Buddhist art, only the Bodhi tree was depicted. But in the later period, we can see that apart from the Bodhi tree, Buddha is also depicted meditating under the Bodhi tree. Coming to the scene of the Great Departure, you can clearly see that in the early period, Buddha was not shown riding the horse. Whereas in the later period, we can clearly see that Buddha is riding his horse Kanthak while departing from the city of Kapilavastu. And this scene shows the death of the Buddha. You can clearly see Buddha lying. Whereas in the early period, the death of the Buddha was represented by a stoop. So this mystery of early Buddhist art has not been resolved yet. And I don't have the answer to this debate either. Thank you for watching.